I watched the Russian.
My opinion, one Hello and welcome to the newest episode of the Signal Horizon podcast. Today I have the great pleasure to talk to Adam Lovinger, the Vice President of the Gold Institute in Washington, D.C. Adam has recently published his first book, I think. Adam, is that correct?
That's correct.
And it's called The Insider Threat, How the Deep State Undermines America from Within, that he published with Encounter Books. And I've also to tip my hat, I'm glad that a publisher like Encounter exists, because otherwise we probably would never hear voices like yours. So that tells me there is still hope when it comes to the publishing industry. Now, Adam, let me ask you a question. The deep state, is it real or is it all a conspiracy theory?
I'm really glad you asked that question, Ralph, because I think that one of the concerns I have is, first of all, that the term deep state, to many people who are not familiar with the workings of Washington, D.C. or the modern, administrative state, it can sound somewhat conspiratorial. And I have to admit that I myself did not think something called the deep state could exist until I encountered it. I think it's important at the outset to really identify what is it, the deep state we're talking about. And in my book, I use actually a definition that I encountered in the New York Times of all places. And that definition is a group of civilian and military officials who work together to undermine democracies from within. And I think that's a useful definition because, the whole notion of undermining a democracy, well, what does that mean? It means subverting federal processes, not following the law, being able to ignore the facts and law with impunity, and really weaponizing government. And, there are several, committees and various study groups in the U.S. House of Representatives that focus on this very problem. It's a very serious problem. And it's something that, fortunately, polls are suggesting that more and more Americans are recognizing that such a thing exists. What I encountered, Ralph, personally, is that I had been in the Department of Defense and the Pentagon for about a dozen years and never encountered what I thought would be something called the deep state. I'm a lawyer by training. I was in the general counsel's office as my first job in the Pentagon. But what I noticed as soon as I went to the Trump White House as the senior director for strategic assessments in the first Trump administration, as soon as I was detailed over to the White House from the Pentagon, I had all these investigations launched against me. Ultimately, I would have 5 investigations launched against me. 3 of them were criminal, 2 of them were administrative, and I'd had a career that was completely spotless for a dozen years. But all of a sudden, as soon as General Mike Flynn, the National Security Advisor, asks for me by name, all these investigations get launched. And what I discovered of the architecture of the deep state is that there are various nodes within the national security bureaucracy. It's certainly not all of it. And I think that that's a problem that many people make is painting with too broad of a brush to cover too many areas. No, what I discovered, Ralph, is that there are certain offices that get taken over, institutionally captured, so that government, and particularly the investigative process, you can destroy people with investigations. This is sort of hermetically sealed off from all accountability. So certain nodes that collaborate with one another to genuinely, subvert U.S. law from within, collaborate with one another. And, not surprisingly, they really do focus on whistleblowers. And in many respects, I like to see, the election of Donald Trump, not once, but twice. Donald Trump is a whistleblower. The American people in electing Donald Trump are electing a whistleblower who's saying there's something really wrong with this country and business as usual. We need to change. Michael Flynn was a whistleblower. He said, there's all these problems. We're not winning our wars anymore. We don't even have strategies to win our wars. I was a whistleblower because I was in the highest strategy office of the Pentagon, realizing that we had no strategies to win our wars. And so when you see who gets attacked by the deep state, it's whistleblowers. And I would say that the American people, frankly, are under attack. It's not just Mike Flynn, myself, or others who are actually inside the national security bureaucracy, but it's really all of America. When you subvert U.S. law, you're really attacking all Americans.
I mean, your book begins in the year of 2017 in the first chapter, and very often it strikes a very personal note, which I think gives actually a certain strength to it, because you speak, as you just also elaborated on, you speak from experience. So this is not, you're not gonna, you're not like an outsider looking in, you're actually an insider looking out, if you want. When we talk about this concept of the deep state, now, would you say, it's probably a little bit of both, but is it driven consciously by the members that, for example, would make up those notes that you describe? Or is it a consequence of attitudes that have been kind of fostered and that members of the state, of the bureaucracy, have for decades been marinated in? For example, is a Peter Strzok and a Lisa Page. Do they, when they do something, do they consciously say, we have to prevent Trump, just to put it as an example? Or is it just that they generally believe that they're actually doing something good? Like, as you laid out early on, and I think you're absolutely correct, the kind of self-perpetuating bureaucracy is really a threat to democracy. But if a member of the deep state, like, for example, Lisa Page would be sitting right here with us, would they claim, oh no, you get it all wrong, we are actually the protectors of democracy. So we are like the safeguards against those who want to come in power and threaten democracy, and hypothetically could do it, but we work in the background. I think there was this anonymous op-ed in the New York Times during Trump's administration that said, yes, the deep state exists and it's us, and we are basically slowing down everything this administration would like to do. So in your assessment, is it something that is done entirely consciously, or do you think it's also, let's call it almost a corporate culture issue, if you will?
Yeah, so I think it's both of those, as well as a third element, and maybe the third element I'll speak about first because you didn't mention it, which was really the if we go back to the Cold War and we look at Cold War history, there was a very concerted effort by America's enemies, principally the Soviet Union, and of course, later, communist China and even more recently, the Islamic Republic of Iran, to really subvert America from within. After the end of the Cold War, we got access to a lot of the Soviet KGB and intelligence archives. And it was really stunning, Ralph, what we found. We found that so many institutions in our country, including our national security bureaucracy, were heavily infiltrated by America's enemies. And the deep state that I saw is also a very ideological deep state, and a deep state that really, in many respects, parrots the talking points and the propaganda of America's enemies. I have in my book, quite, a lot of this, a lot of the evidence of it. But truly, the highest level strategists in the Pentagon, saying things that, like losing Taiwan to China is not an insult to national interests, or that Russia has no imperialist or hegemonic aspirations. I mean, all of this downplaying of the threat, and simultaneously not, doing his job, which was to, craft national security strategies so that we could win and prevail. He was adopting this attitude, which he was very open about, which is the sort of the attitude that you see on American university campuses these days in many respects, the pro-Hamas view. I teach at Georgetown University. I went to Georgetown University. My oldest son is graduating from Georgetown University. It's a university we hold very close to our heart. And just the other day, Ralph, there was some graffiti on the front of the business school. So on one hand, it's like you have some of the graffiti saying "Free Palestine," and on the other side, it says the U.S. Army equals imperialism. And so this is a sort of broader anti-Americanism that is certainly supported by our enemies, but also it's nurtured in many of our institutions here, including our universities. And then it's no surprise that those worldviews get transferred into our national security bureaucracy, and what I saw. So that's an aspect I think is very important and underappreciated. coming back to your real question about, is it one or the other? I do believe that there is a tremendous arrogance amongst many civil servants who believe that the American people are stupid people and that they know best. And this is a very caustic thing, because when you look at the founders and our of the United States and our constitutional order, these men who crafted our constitutional order were very aware of the limitations of any one person. And so, as students of the British and French Enlightenment, they sought to create a system where you had many different views coming together, and through sort of a refiner's fire, identifying, practical solutions to important problems. And so it's not one individual, one bureaucrat who's saying, I know what's best for you. It is that there are the American people, they elect their representatives, they send people to government, including the federal bureaucracy, who recognize the limitations of the individual, and therefore want to create a collaborative process, and a process that brings to light the wisest solutions. And so these people like Lisa Page, Peter Strzok are, truly of a authoritarian mindset, assuming that they know better. And, you just have to look at, the last, I would say, 30 years of U.S. foreign policy. And I mean, there's so many mistakes we've made. And it's often these mistakes because other points of view were not considered. And certain elites sort of, stuffed this thing down our throat, stuffed some sort of, solution that they thought was best in a very authoritarian way, which was totally antithetical to what this country is supposed to be about. And I think that we work much better when we do follow in the footsteps of of our Constitution. And then, finally, so there's that conscious notion that, yes, we know better. And then there is, over time, this, as you said, sort of an atmosphere that gets created of a disconnect from the people, a real sort of sense amongst bureaucrats that they're not really working or even accountable to the ordinary people. They're looking after themselves, their own institutional interests. They're maybe looking after the interests of defense contractors, various private sector interests. And when you get that sort of corruption, Ralph, is really when America's enemies, principally the Russians, Chinese, and the Iranians, they recognize, there's this lack of accountability. We're going to exploit that corruption, and we're going to insinuate ourselves in, and genuinely get these bureaucrats to work for us. And I believe that a lot of what Peter Strzok and Lisa Page were doing, I mean, they were perpetuating a Russian foreign influence operation. We know that the Steele dossier, which they advanced, was the product of Russian disinformation. And so, whether they knew it or not, but it's their mindset of this sort of secretiveness, the secret decision making that gets exploited by America's enemies.
I'm going back to what you said at the beginning, because I think that gets to the heart of the matter. I mean, is there, for lack of a better way to put it, do you think there is, in some areas at least, a lack of patriotism or loyalty to one's own country within the American bureaucracy, based on, as you described it, the way higher education works? And I would immediately add, not just in the United States. I think that's a problem we have all over the West. I think you can see it in Germany, you can see it in the UK, you can see it here in Austria, so you can see it in France. For a very long time, patriotism, I would assume, was almost taken as a given for civil servants, for the public service. But I think that's no longer the case. And as you just elaborated, that can be a problem if that is no longer at least part of the motivation. I mean, people, of course, they also want to make, they want to make a living, that's all clear. But they also should have, as an esprit de corps that consists of a sense of patriotism and loyalty to one's country. And sometimes it appears that this is missing. Or I'm overstating this.
No, I think you're right on, Ralph. It is a real problem. I mean, I went to a bunch of these universities that have been breaking out in all these anti-American protests, and it's a very serious thing. I mean, these kids do grow up and they do get jobs in the U.S. government, and then they do horrible things. For example, I mean, just like last month, there was an investigation that revealed that there was a CIA officer uh, who leaked Israel's plans to retaliate against Iran, and this is somebody who clearly does not believe in the West or protecting our democratic allies or any of the principles that.
And I think there was a similar case in the State Department, and that person wasn't even fired.
That's correct. That's correct. It's really a horrendous state of affairs, and I think that one thing to really pay attention to is that a lot of this worldview that these kids are getting in their universities is genuinely funded by the Russians, the Chinese, but also the Qataris. For example, I went to graduate school at Columbia University, and we now know that a lot of these protests are being funded by the Chinese government as well as the government of Qatar. So who are these kids? I mean, do they really want to be taken as dupes or stooges for America's enemies? And is that really the role they want to play? I mean, it's complete madness when you look at the countries. If they claim that they're supporting human rights, well, they're being funded. Their protests, the tents that they're setting up on campuses, I mean, these are being paid for by the Communist Party of China, which is conducting genocide against its Uyghurs. I mean, this connection to America's enemies and how these, I don't know if you even want to call it, leftists, but I guess they would consider themselves leftists. They're really the dupes of these horrible authoritarian regimes, and it's a problem. And it's such a problem that, I mean, even a lot of the faculties are being corrupted. American universities get a lot of money from countries like Qatar. Georgetown University even has a campus in Qatar. Qatar is the chief supporter of Hamas. I mean, it's really, we've reached a ridiculous situation that we just need to wake up to and to address.
One of your chapters is called, and I think this dovetails nicely what you just said, is called Adopting Russia's Foreign Policy for America's Own. Now, I don't want to give away too much because I still want people to buy the book, but maybe in a few sentences, what are you talking about in this chapter? What do you mean by this adopting Russia's foreign policy as one's own?
Yeah, so there's, so you look at the presidency of Barack Obama. I mean, Barack Obama, like myself, he went to Columbia University. He had many professors that were, real sort of like third world apologists who downplayed the atrocities of others, but fixated monomaniacally on all the problems of the West. So Obama was really the first president in American history I think we've had who genuinely believed in this anti-American view that America was a racist, imperialist, oppressor nation, and the natural consequences of that is if that is your worldview. And of course, he did a very, very good job at concealing this. But there's enough evidence that this is genuinely a constant theme throughout his life, even to the very present. You go on the Obama Foundation website, and he is still an advocate of the diversity, equity, and inclusion sham, which we know is, diversity, of course, is a kind of throwaway. Inclusion is just a lie because, for example, certainly Jewish students on Ivy League campuses who get attacked by these mobs are not being included, and they're minorities. But the real key to DEI is equity. And this is genuinely about, coming to your question about adopting Russia's foreign policy of our own, this is genuinely about achieving equity, not only domestically, but internationally. The whole notion of a preeminent America, an America that exercises primacy over the world, is abhorrent to someone like Obama, who sees us as a racist, oppressor nation, imperialist. And so the whole idea in adopting Russia's foreign policy is to create that equity in the DEI sort of calculus. Let's, diminish American power. Let's raise the power of our adversaries. This is a good thing through the framework of someone like Obama, the DEI people, the people that see America as an imperialist country. And so the chapter in the book that you mentioned, Ralph, is genuinely focused on, let's look at Russia's foreign policy documents, the actual published Russian foreign policy documents. And these documents, these strategies for the Russian Federation call for equity. They call for, let's achieve a balance of influence in the world. Well, what does that mean? A balance of influence means if you have a weak Russia and a strong America, it means transferring power from one to the other. And this is genuinely, the view that Obama adopted. And as I show in that particular chapter you mentioned, I talk about how those people that worked for him, like Admiral Mullen, a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, wanted to balance America with Iran in the Middle East. I mean, these absurd things. I mean, essentially taking the talking points of our adversaries and adopting them for our own. But also James H. Baker, the director of the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon, truly holding abhorrent anti-American views. But in his view, it's good to weaken America and strengthen our adversaries.
But Adam, we all know that Donald Trump is the true puppet of Russia. I mean, you will not deny this, will you?
Well, I certainly will. And there's, the political left, as you know so well, Ralph, throughout the Cold War up into the present, they do something time and again. It's a pattern of behavior. It's called projection and deflection. It's really a KGB tactic. It's like you're accusing your adversary of what you yourself are doing. So we have, for example, what did Obama do in 2012? He asked for some flexibility on the campaign trail from Vladimir Putin. He had a conversation with Dmitry Medvedev, who at the time was the president of the Russian Federation, and he said, "Look, listen, I'm encountering a election, the 2012 presidential election. I need some flexibility. I need some space. Help me win this election, Vladimir Putin, and I will then have more flexibility to reward you once I get back into office." The left is so compromised, Ralph, by America's enemies. There was 3 U.S. House of Representatives committees that released a report in October. Actually, no, it was in August. Over the summer, late summer of this year, that all showed that Joe Biden's family took tens of millions of dollars from the Chinese government. And this has become sort of this normalized thing in the Democratic Party. You look at the Clinton Foundation, tens of millions of dollars from foreign interests, and it's become normalized. People don't even bat an eye to it. So this notion that Donald Trump is the puppet of Russia is really, laughable, in part because there was also a 3-year investigation called the Mueller investigation that found that there was absolutely no collaboration between Trump and the Russians, and nor with his campaign. And this was at a cost of $40 million to the U.S. taxpayer, only to realize that there was nothing there. And so this canard keeps getting projected and for the purposes of deflection from the political left, trying to smear Trump. But I don't think the American people are believing it anymore. And I think that a lot of Americans are really resentful that they were lied to so egregiously by the Hillary Clinton campaign and all of her supporters and luminaries in the Democratic Party.
But it's not just right. It was not just about Trump. I think it was the Wall Street Journal journalist Kimberly Strassel, whom you also mentioned in your book. I think she wrote, I forgot the date. Was it in 2015 or 2014? She wrote an entire book about how the IRS, the American tax agency, went after conservative NGOs or conservative institutes under his administration, and it was done very openly, right? That they couldn't get tax deductions, so they were the screws were put on them, and as you said, or it was just it was like, well, those are conservatives, the Tea Party movement, it's something on the right. So there was always particular, and this is a topic that you touch upon it a little bit in your book, but I kind of would like to hear more of it about it from you. What about the media? Because very often it strikes to me, the deep state, it appears to me, at least on occasion, operates quite openly. But the reason why we don't hear much about it is because the media either refuses or openly or secretly supports what the deep state is doing. So it almost appears as normal. Like, for example, under Barack Obama, when the state was used, when the Justice Department was weaponized, when we hear, for example, Eric Holder, I think the Attorney General under Obama, who called Obama, I think, my boy, and that he's his wingman, and now we hear, oh my God, Trump is going to have a loyalist as Attorney General. So as you said, it's this double standard, but it's also the role of the media that seems to entirely ignore these things that were going on that should worry everyone, regardless if you consider yourself to be on the political right or on the political left.
Yeah, you raise two very important points, Ralph. One of them is the media, and the other is just the extent of the deep state. I mean, of course, in my book, because I don't want to talk about things I didn't see firsthand, I focus principally on the national security state, national security bureaucracy, the intelligence community foremost. But you're right, it does extend to the IRS as well. It's no secret. If you look at the voting patterns of the area that I live in, this is a little bit north of Washington, D.C. You look at Washington, D.C. itself, you look at Northern Virginia. This is where the senior bureaucrats live, in this sort of inside the Beltway, a little bit outside the Beltway. This is where the senior bureaucrats live. This is one of the most blue states, one of the most uniformly democratic areas of the entire nation. So if people ask, well, how can you possibly have this conspiracy of ideologues? How is that possible? No, it sounds like crazy talk. This sounds like nonsense. You have to think about it. These various nodes that I talked about previously that have been captured, very critical positions. The inspectors general, these are kind of boring jobs in many respects. The inspectors general, the U.S. Office of Special Counsel, various offices in general counsel's offices and various agencies, the security clearance adjudication bodies, various personnel offices, things that most Americans would find very boring. These things have been captured and weaponized by rather fierce partisan political operatives, very ideological. But to your point about the IRS, they're swimming in a sea of like-minded people who see somebody like Donald Trump or like General Flynn, or a much lesser case like myself, who's like, okay, these are people that are going to come in and they're going to disrupt. They're disrupting our cozy relations and our power. These are threats to our power. So let's use whatever tools we have to weaponize against them. We'll call Donald Trump a Russian agent. We'll call Mike Flynn a Russian agent. They called me all sorts of things. And then let's use whatever we have to destroy them. And, I can see it if, one ideologue, senior or government official, comes to an IRS agent and says, listen, start, looking at these conservatives, they're collaborating with the Russians. This is they'll be like, okay, well, what am I going to do? My boss is telling me to target these conservative groups. They're collaborating with the Russians. I see this in the media, which comes to your second point about the media. There's a genuine, I like to, mostly talk about things that I've experienced firsthand. My experience with the media is that there were genuine lies that I have evidence were lies that were leaked to the media in my case, including to Julian Barnes and Adam Goldman of the New York Times. And there are these lies that get leaked. I go to them, I say, hey guys, look, here's the evidence that what you wrote about me is false. They have no interest in correcting the record. And what I am told and what I've seen and what various journalists have admitted is that if you're covering the US government, if you're covering the national security bureaucracy, you have to keep them happy or they won't leak to you anymore. So of course you're going to print whatever they want you to do. What I'm saying in my book is that this, this may be something that, helps you a little, your career as a journalist, a little bit in the near term. But if the more you report these lies, the more you're undermining not only yourself, but your paper and your entire profession of journalism. I mean, fake news, my God, but the first time I heard Trump say that, I was like, I'm not so sure about that. But my God, when I experienced it myself, when I saw it firsthand, these lies that get, leaked to the press, for the purpose of destroying people, it's a real epidemic, and no wonder so many Americans don't trust the media anymore, and that mainstream media is really suffering because they've discredited themselves, and it's a terrible tragedy. It's very hard to rebuild one's credibility once you lose it so dramatically.
But as you mentioned, I mean, you're right, I don't want to stick to the media topic for too long, but just as a side note, I mean, I think it was the New York Times who got a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting on the Russia collusion and the Steele dossier, which, as you mentioned early on, which were Russian disinformation on the one hand and basically a fake story on the other hand. And I'm just surprised by the ethos that is lacking in parts of the media establishment. Getting a prize for top-notch journalism about something that more or less did not happen. I mean, that's just because this goes back to also what you said, and I think within the institutions within which you worked, right? Kind of when it comes to national defense, there is, we heard a lot about the fear of a civil war. And again, I think that's not, at least at this point in time, I don't think that's very realistic. But that there is an ideological civil war, if you want. I think that is harder and harder to deny. Exactly what you described. Like you have, for lack of a better term, you have those forces who think that American primacy is a good thing, that is something that needs to be sustained, that is worthwhile dedicating resources and energy towards. And then you have those, as you described, to think, well, the world should be this balance where the United States are just one nation among many, and the Iranians are not really better than us, and who are we to say? Kind of the Obama-esque approach that you mentioned. Now, in your view, because you had another chapter 15, which I found also very intriguing, which is called An Existential Threat to the Deep State. Now tell us, what is the existential threat to the deep state? Or at least, tease us a little bit what you would say the existential threat is.
Yeah. So there's a tradition in American history, in American politics, of insiders who become a threat to the establishment. So, for example, Teddy Roosevelt, who was sort of, I guess in many respects, he's considered a progressive, but he was an American aristocrat from a very wealthy family, and he came in and became known as a trust buster, breaking up these monopolies that were being held by these major American corporations. And he was termed a traitor to his class. But Americans, rightly, I think from all sides of the aisle, really, revere him for doing that because he genuinely put the interests of the country before, this cabal of elites. So I write about an existential threat to the deep state. I write about General Michael Flynn, and he was a U.S. Army intelligence officer. His career lasted 33 years in the U.S. Army. He rose to great heights. He's considered by many of his fellow generals to be the best intelligence officer of his generation. And, in intelligence, I mean, of course, he's mostly focused on foreign intelligence as a U.S. Army officer, but you also have to have a pretty good sense of corruption and what motivates people and this sort of thing. And as head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, he really wanted to understand, okay, if he's heading this agency, why is it wasting so much money? So he ordered an audit to see what was going wrong with this place and where were all these funds going, and really understood that there was tremendous amounts of corruption, particularly government contracting. And so General Flynn really he's the main topic of this Chapter 15, Existential Threat to the Deep State, is that he's an insider. He knows the dirty tricks. He knows how the corruption is done. And what made him so threatening, Ralph, is that here you had Donald Trump, who's an outsider. He's a classic outsider, but he's elected by the American people to come in and smash up the corrupt enterprises that's really driving America into the ground, and to arrest that decay, that rot in the American government, and and that in and of itself is not so threatening to the deep state. But when you have an insider like General Michael Flynn, who knows their dirty tricks, and he has the confidence of the U.S. president, there's few jobs in the U.S. government that are more powerful than the U.S. National Security Advisor if a president has confidence in that individual. If the president doesn't have confidence in that individual, he's completely powerless. But if he has confidence, and Trump really did, that made General Michael Flynn an existential threat to the deep state, because he knew the corruption, he knew how it operated, and he was digging into it. Even during the transition from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, he was talking with John Brennan, who was Obama's CIA director, and Jim Clapper, the DNI director, James Comey. He knew precisely how these guys, Obama's spy chiefs, were targeting the Trump campaign with the Russiagate stuff. He already was detecting it. And so these guys, before they left office, conspired with Obama to destroy Michael Flynn, absolutely destroy him, because he was the existential threat. It was genuinely a kill or be killed moment, and they chose to attack.
I mean, one has to say, and really express one's deepest respect to the American people, that despite everything that happened, they gave Donald Trump a second chance this year. And if we look at what he's attempting to do, because we kind of looked a lot in the past, right, in the experiences and what was going on, are you hopeful about the future? Do you have, if you would have to say, okay, here are your highest expectations for the incoming administrations, and here are your lowest expectations for the incoming administration, what would you say? What would make you happy, and what would make you just satisfied?
Yeah. So, I mean, fortunately, Donald Trump himself has learned a lot from 2016. When he entered office, he said things like, well, I don't think I need to fill this job or this job with a political appointee because I don't really see the benefit of that office, and so I'm just going to ignore it. That was a real mistake of an outsider, because not only you need to fill these political appointee jobs to prevent the deep state from attacking your administration. So that signals weakness and naivete to the permanent bureaucracy. And you don't have your people there to protect you as the president, which is what a lot of the job of a political appointee is to do, is to make sure that the government is not getting weaponized to go after an administration. And we saw during Trump 45 that you had all of these attacks, including from within inside his own National Security Council with the Vindemans and all these leaks. I mean, the number of leaks were excessive, and
horrible, yeah.
So it's really critical. I think that you answer your question about being hopeful. I am quite hopeful. I think that a lot of his Trump's picks are very good picks. I'm very happy with Mike Waltz as National Security Advisor, Pete Hegseth as Defense Secretary. I think Pete Hegseth, he is more of an outsider. He will need insiders advising him. I think that's very important. I'm extremely happy with John Ratcliffe going to CIA. John Ratcliffe really understands how America's enemies have sort of rigged Washington, D.C. to create these incentive structures so that so many U.S. government officials will do the bidding for the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians for them. Ratcliffe is one of the real experts on that. And so that's a great sign that there's a recognition of the problem. So far, so good. As far as the picks, I can tell you, I am quite hopeful. But the other thing that we have to keep in mind is that the deep state is ready for this new administration, and they've learned a lot. they've learned a lot since Russiagate, and they've refined their tactics and their techniques and their schemes, and they're not going to go quietly. And it's genuinely a murderous enterprise. In chapter 23, I don't know if you're going sequentially, but I report a murder for the very first time. I mean, these are horrible people who, but it shouldn't surprise you if you know that, they're working for the Russians or the Chinese. I mean, that's what our enemies do.
I mean, do you think that changing those at the top will be enough, or for lack of a better term, once again, that you almost need something as a metaphorical, if you want, purge of parts of the civil service, like firing people and replacing them? Because as you say, these people have been, so I was so happy that you started with the issues at the universities, because these people have been marinated and socialized in a very specific worldview, and they're not going to change. And you see this now again, because one of the reasons why I pivoted a little bit to the media was also to emphasize that even now that the election is over, they still don't understand what happened, right? Their attitudes have changed not at all, not in the least bit. So I think even then within the deep state, right, those bureaucrats, those members of those nodes that you described, they will not say, you know what, now it's time for self-reflection. Maybe we were wrong and the American people were right. Potentially, exactly as you indicated, they're going to do the opposite. They're going to say, now we have to be even more against this administration. So wouldn't it be almost the only solution to say, resign, and we're going to rehire, replace you with people that are not loyal to President Trump, but loyal to the ideas that you also describe in your book. So that's very important for me also. Your book is, it's which again is a great thing. It's all over the place. It's partially biographical. It's partially historical, but I think it also has a philosophical approach. Exactly what you described. And okay, what are the issues at hand? And if you have a dominant philosophy that goes against the ideas that you describe in your book, like the importance of American primacy, well, don't you have to replace those who hold the opposing philosophy with those who share your philosophy?
Yeah, I think you do. I think though we do need to be, careful and judicious. One of the things I think is very important for conservatives and the Republican Party and the Trump administration is not to essentially become a fulfilling prophecy. And well, actually, maybe that's not the right word, but to essentially become what we're being accused of. I think that we need to proceed judiciously, carefully, but decisively. Decisively. I think we need to go through, and I'm very happy that there's this Department on Government Efficiency. I think this is a very smart thing, is to go through and look at this government and really ask, what are these agencies doing? And what are these offices doing? And is this an important thing that the federal government should be doing? And regardless of who's in that office or not, if it's not doing, an important job, we should eliminate it. That's the fiduciary duty we owe the U.S. taxpayer. So I think we need to do that. Fortunately, we have a lot of information on who these genuine criminal conspirators are. And I use the term criminal conspirators very purposefully because my definition of the deep state are those who are really actively weaponizing federal processes. And that's an abuse of authority, and that's a crime. That's 18 U.S.C. 1505. It's a very serious crime. And we have lots of information on who these people are. I think as a first step, we do need to purge the government of these criminals and maybe even indict them. The Department of Justice may need to indict them and to really, make an example. Because one of the most extraordinary things, Ralph, that has perplexed me is just how little accountability there is. I mean, these criminals have been committing crimes for years, for decades, and they are not held to account. And I don't know what's wrong with Congress. I mean, is Congress part of this corruption? I don't know. I've not worked in Congress. I suspect there may be an element of that, but I don't want to cast aspersions until I know the facts. But I do think we need to proceed judiciously. We need to get rid of the bad apples and to then hire people that genuinely are patriots, that believe in the U.S. Constitution. and don't see America as a racist imperialist country that they must secretly undermine from within.
I mean, you, I think, correct me if I'm wrong. I think you're also a graduate of Georgetown Law School, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Correct.
So yes, so you're somebody who's also interested in the judicial and legal procedures. And I was wondering, one of the things that appears to me has worked very well in the first Trump administration was the appointments for the judicial branch, for the appointment of judges. And a lot of this was based on names prepared by the Federalist Society. Do you think that there should be, or that there could be, and this might be something that's interesting for the conservative leading think tank world, that in a similar way there should be individuals being groomed, being prepared, right? If a conservative government, if Trump, and there will be elections after Trump, if they come into office, that there are names at the ready that then can be put into the right positions in the same way that names were ready for Supreme Court nominations and for federal court nominations.
I think this is an important thing. I've never seen any of these lists.
I mean, lists sounds always horrible, but I think
Yeah,
it's the most appropriate
of
term.
loyalists. But I've heard second, third hand that these lists exist. I don't know how the process works. One of the things that worries me, Ralph, is that this is getting a little bit into the weeds. Is that there's almost like this kind of beauty contest of people who are publishing articles to show that they're the right person for the job, but so much of the most important work is not anything you actually want to publicize. You don't want to, if you're a great strategic thinker and you're going to add tremendous benefit to a new Trump administration, you don't want to be publishing your strategies publicly to show how smart you are. So, because those strategies, by definition, must be secretive and close hold. Otherwise, it's like you're essentially broadcasting to America's enemies what we're planning on doing. And so, I mean, there's lots of people I know who've worked on various very serious projects, but who could very well be and have developed real hard-hitting strategies to win against America's enemies and to keep America preeminent in the world, but who would not dare publish this stuff publicly because it is foolish. It's self-defeating. So I do think there needs to be a better way of vetting, truly, the best possible appointees for jobs, and not just this sort of public beauty contest, because it's an 850 word op-ed written every 2 weeks by somebody is no litmus test for being a brilliant strategist or policymaker.
Your final chapter is called A Call to Action. So tell us, what's the call and what's the action?
Yeah, so I've actually been working on this quite a bit. A lot of the best stuff I don't even have in the book because I don't want to advertise it to our enemies, frankly. But the book is rather demoralizing, and part of my ethos, I don't ever want to end on a hopeless note. I'm a strategist. I'm a national security strategist by training. So my job is to uncover, to find the path ahead. And I just wanted to remind the reader that the problem we're facing is not a new problem. It goes back to ancient times. I mean, I talk a bit about Cicero and the fall of the Roman, how the Roman Republic became an authoritarian Roman Empire. I talk about some of the problems that France experienced in the late 19th century and how that internal rot prevented it, really precipitated its fall from great power status. I'm trying to, issue a warning from history, but also to let people know we have come out of this before. I mentioned the Church Committee, for example, that was established, set up, named after Democratic Senator Frank Church after the abuses of the intelligence agencies really came to light. I think that there are things the Church Committee did well and did not so well. And there's a lot of lessons for us to learn. But I wanted to, end on a positive note. One thing that I do mention in that last chapter is that these deep state operatives are cowardly thugs who operate. They're like a pack of hyenas that conspire, collaborate together to take down noble lions who, like General Flynn, who was standing there. A pack of hyenas descended upon him and tore him to shreds, destroyed his career when it was really at the height. And these are people that we need to take out one by one and to make an example of them. And I don't mean that as a form of revenge. I just mean actually holding them to account for their crimes, because the American people have made it very clear that they are sick and tired of these corrupt officials who take very generous salaries from the American taxpayer, genuinely committing crimes and getting away with it. And
nobody ever gets fired, right? As Donald Trump said, nobody ever gets fired.
No, I mean, I have reams of evidence of genuine criminal misconduct in my book and elsewhere. A lot of it's not even in the book. And these people still hold office. They've never been held to account. How is that possible? I mean, it's outrageous. And you look at polls of the American people, this is something that really upsets the American people. So I do think that one of the best possible things that a Trump Department of Justice can do in this coming administration is to apply the law fairly and not let criminals get away with committing crimes, including murder, as I show in the book. Yeah. And so it's a horrible thing. These people need to be held to account. That will heal a lot of America. You mentioned, my legal background. When I took criminal law, I learned something very interesting, which was that when a crime is committed, not only is the person who's directly on the receiving end of the crime hurt, the entire community is hurt. And the purpose of criminal law is to bring the community back into equilibrium, for people to know that there is equality under the law, that everybody who's even not been a crime victim, if they were to be one, they would have that equal treatment. Mm. And so America is at a huge disequilibrium right now, Ralph, where there's a view that conservatives and Republicans are held to one standard. People who are part of the ideological pro-Hamas and pro-China, pro-Russia, pro-Iran, fringe get held to another one. It's kind of like the January 6th people versus the George Floyd people. It's like there is a massive double standard here. And I don't care which side of the aisle you're on or which ideological part of the spectrum you're on. If Americans are not equal under the law, then everything is for naught.
On that note, what's next for Adam Lovinger, and where can people find your work?
Well, I'm, certainly people can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Like I said, I don't have a lot of time to do things that are not consequential, so I don't show my work. My work is not available. You're not going to find it. I don't know what's next. I am very excited about this administration. Maybe there's a job for me in this administration. I don't know yet, but I do think that we're certainly entering a more hopeful era, and I will do everything I can till the last breath in my lungs to ensure that our liberal democracy, our constitutional republic, stays healthy. And so I will be broadly focused on that effort. But as to the specifics, I can't tell you right now because I just don't know myself.
Well, on that note, I can tell you there are some things that Adam is sharing. The book is called The Insider Threat: How the Deep State Undermines America from Within. It was published by Encounter Books. You can find the link both to Amazon and to the publisher in this video's description. I highly recommend that you get it. I think it's out now in hardcover and as a Kindle version, so there is no excuse not to get it and not to read it. By the way, Christmas is around the corner. It will also make a great Christmas present. Adam, thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to having you on again in the future.
Thank you, Ralph. I really appreciate it.